A colony can carry 40,000 bees and still fail to fill a single super. That is not a paradox. That is brood distribution working against honey storage. The population exists. The foragers exist. But the internal geometry of the brood nest, where the queen laid, where the brood developed, which frames carry open larvae and which carry capped cells, that geometry determines whether foragers go into the field or stay inside the hive, managing brood that was placed incorrectly weeks before the nectar flow began. Have you seen this in your own colonies? A strong box, heavy with bees. And at the end of the main flow, shallow storage, half-capped frames, and an outcome that does not reflect the population you observed. If that pattern has repeated itself across seasons, the answer is not the weather. The answer is not the bees. The answer is inside the brood nest, in how brood was distributed across frames. When that distribution became uneven, and what the colony was forced to spend its nursing capacity on during the most critical foraging window of the year. If this is useful to you, take a moment to like this video. It helps this channel reach beekeepers who are working through exactly this problem. What most beekeepers misunderstand is this. The honey a colony stores during the main nectar flow is not produced by the bees that are alive at the moment the flowers open. It is produced by the bees that emerge from capped brood in the days and weeks before that flow begins. The foraging force that collects nectar during peak bloom is a population that was laid as an egg 3 weeks earlier. Its size, its readiness, its foraging efficiency, all of it was set in motion before a single flower opened. And if the brood that produced that foraging force was distributed unevenly across the brood nest, clustered on one side, thinned on another, patterned in a way that forced the colony to concentrate nurse bees in fragmented zones rather than in a unified, thermally efficient cluster, then that foraging force arrives at the nectar flow already compromised. More bees, less honey. That is the outcome of uneven brood distribution, not a mysterious colony failure. Not bad genetics, a structural problem inside the brood nest that produced a foraging mismatch at exactly the wrong moment. This mechanism has been observed by practical beekeepers since the early decades of managed apiculture. Field practitioners working in the American Midwest and across Northern Europe between 1910 and 1940 documented what they called broken brood, frames with irregular laying patterns, gaps in the capped brood surface, inconsistent cell coverage, as a reliable predictor of underperforming colonies during major honey flows. They did not yet have the vocabulary of modern apidology, but their records described what we now understand through brood biology, that uneven brood distribution is not simply an aesthetic flaw in the laying pattern. It is a physiological disruption that forces the colony into a state of chronic nurse bee redistribution, elevated brood thermoregulation cost, and delayed forager transition, all during a period when every biological resource should be pointed toward nectar collection. The mistake happened weeks earlier. To understand how uneven brood distribution reduces honey storage, the mechanism must be followed from its origin, through its consequences in sequence. The queen does not distribute her eggs randomly. Under stable conditions, with a uniform comb surface, adequate warmth, and a healthy, well-fed colony entering its expansion phase, the queen lays in a compact, expanding spiral pattern from the center of the brood nest outward. This pattern is not decorative. It is thermally functional. A dense, centralized brood area is easier for nurse bees to heat than a scattered one. The colony can maintain the precise temperature range, 34 to 35 degrees Celsius, 93 to 95 degrees Fahrenheit, required for normal larval development across a larger cell area when that area is geometrically compact. When brood is distributed unevenly, when there are empty cells interspersed through the laying area, when brood frames are separated by frames of honey or pollen that were not moved at the right time, when the queen has been forced to skip cells due to comb irregularities or previous brood disease, the thermal surface area that nurse bees must cover becomes inefficient. More bees must stay inside the hive to maintain developmental temperature across a fragmented brood surface. The colony pays a thermoregulation tax on every nurse bee that is stationed at the perimeter of a broken brood pattern, rather than transitioning toward the foraging threshold. The development timeline is fixed. An egg laid by the queen hatches after 3 days. The larva is fed and capped after approximately 9 days. The capped cell completes metamorphosis, and the adult worker emerges after a total of 21 days from egg to emergence. Nothing in that timeline can be compressed. A nurse bee allocated to brood care in the first 12 days of adult life will not transition to foraging until that nursing commitment is completed. If the colony is carrying more open brood than its nurse-bee ratio can efficiently manage, because brood is spread across more frames than thermal clustering can support, then transition to foraging is delayed, and that delay compounds. Growth without timing is loss. The seasonal context in which uneven brood distribution causes the most damage is the pre-flow expansion window, the period of 4 to 6 weeks before the main nectar flow begins, when a well-managed colony should be in a phase of rapid, organized brood expansion, building toward the forager population that will work the bloom. In temperate climates across North America and Northern Europe, this expansion window typically falls between late March and mid-May, depending on regional spring timing and the dominant nectar plant. In areas where clover, basswood, or apple bloom represents the primary honey production opportunity, the window between colony expansion and peak nectar availability can be as short as 3 to 4 weeks. In areas dependent on single-crop agriculture, canola, buckwheat, sunflower, that window may compress further, with the entire productive flow occurring over 14 to 21 days. Within that window, every frame of brood that develops unevenly is a liability. Every nurse bee retained inside the hive, beyond her natural foraging transition point, is a reduction in the foraging force available during peak bloom. And every reduction in the foraging force during a flowering window of 2 to 3 weeks produces a proportional reduction in honey stored. This is where small-scale beekeeping operations absorb the most concentrated economic damage. A hobbyist or small producer operating 5 to 15 colonies does not have the volume to absorb a 20% reduction in per-colony honey yield. The main nectar flow, whether it runs 2 weeks or 6, is frequently the single honey production event of the year. If the foraging force that arrives at that flow is reduced by 15 to 25% because nurse bees were misallocated during the pre-flow brood period, the income loss is not recoverable within that season. The flowering window does not extend for a second attempt. The physical appearance of uneven brood distribution is visible during inspection, but it must be read correctly. A frame that appears to carry 90% capped brood with scattered empty cells may not be a problem. If those empty cells represent recently emerged adults that have already transitioned out of the nurse role, a frame with large irregular gaps in the capped surface may indicate a more serious disruption, either an inconsistent laying pattern from the queen, comb damage that interrupted cell availability, chalk brood, or other brood disease clearing cells post-capping, or a nurse bee population that was insufficient to feed all open larvae during a previous cold stress event. The difference matters because the treatment is different, and applying the wrong interpretation to what you are seeing on the frame is how management errors compound. A proper inspection sequence for evaluating brood distribution should begin not with the brood frames themselves, but with the population structure outside of them. Before pulling any brood frame, assess the covering population. How many frames of bees are present? A colony should carry enough adult bees to cover all brood frames, plus 1 to 2 additional frames at the point of Preflow expansion. Fewer than that, and the brood nest is overextended relative to the nurse bee capacity, a condition that will produce uneven brood development regardless of the queen's laying pattern, because the larvae in the outer cells of wide brood frames will be undernursed. Once the population assessment is complete, pull the brood frames, beginning from the edge of the brood nest, and work toward the center. The outside frames will typically show the clearest evidence of distribution problems. Brood at the margins of the nest is most vulnerable to thermal inconsistency, most likely to be undernursed during population stress, and most likely to carry the scattered, irregular pattern that indicates a brood nest that has expanded beyond the colony's ability to maintain it uniformly. Document the number of frames carrying open brood. Document the number carrying capped brood. Note whether open brood and capped brood are intermixed on the same frame, or whether the pattern shows clear developmental separation. Open brood in the center of frames, capped brood toward the outside, which is the normal, healthy pattern in an expanding brood nest. Intermixing of open and capped brood on the same frame, without clear developmental logic, is one early indicator of brood distribution disruption. Inspection intervals during the Preflow expansion window should be set at 7 to 10 days, close enough to catch developing problems before they have progressed through a full brood cycle, but not so frequent that inspections themselves become a thermal disturbance to a brood nest that is trying to maintain developmental temperature. The mistake progression model for uneven brood distribution follows a predictable sequence across early, mid, and late season that most beekeepers do not recognize as connected until the honey harvest reveals the outcome. In early spring, late February through March, in temperate climates, the colony is in cluster contraction. The queen has resumed laying, but the laying area is small, centralized, and thermally efficient. At this stage, the brood distribution is almost always compact by necessity. The colony does not have the population to maintain a wide brood area, and the cluster geometry forces the laying pattern to remain tight. Early season brood distribution problems are relatively uncommon, but they can be initiated by premature feeding stimulation applied before the ambient temperature and population are sufficient to support expansion. If sugar syrup feeding is applied before nighttime temperatures have stabilized above 10 degrees Celsius, 50 degrees Fahrenheit, the queen may be stimulated to expand her laying area faster than the nurse bee population can cover. The result is a brood nest that is physically wider than it is biologically supportable. Outer cells of expanded frames remain undernursed. Larvae in those cells receive inconsistent feeding. The brood that emerges from those cells is physiologically weaker, lower adult weight, shorter flight duration, reduced foraging capacity. And the nurse bees that were stretched across that over-wide brood surface arrive at their foraging transition, already having spent more metabolic resources on thermoregulation than a compact brood nest would have required. The risk of premature stimulation is not theoretical. It is a standard early season management error that sets a distribution problem in motion before the beekeeper recognizes that anything has gone wrong. By the time the consequences are visible during a mid-April or May inspection, the brood cohort that will become the primary Preflow foraging force is already in development, already shaped by the conditions that nurse bees provided during the open larval stage 3 to 4 weeks earlier. The mistake happened in February or March. The consequence arrives in May. Mid-season, the period from April through early June, is where uneven brood distribution is most commonly observed, most frequently misread, and most consequentially mismanaged. A common mid-season error is the response to population crowding. When a colony has built to 8 or more frames of bees, and the brood nest appears compressed, many beekeepers add space above the brood nest by inserting empty frames or placing a honey super before the colony's foraging force is ready to work it. This response feels logical. It follows the standard advice to prevent swarming through space management. But the timing and the method of that space addition determines whether it relieves brood nest congestion or worsens brood distribution. Empty frames inserted directly into the brood nest, particularly frames of foundation rather than drawn comb, create a physical barrier that disrupts the queen's laying continuity. If a foundation frame is placed between 2 frames of open brood, the queen must bypass it or lay across an unfamiliar surface. The resulting brood pattern on surrounding frames becomes compressed, irregular, or temporarily interrupted. Nurse bees must now cover open brood on either side of an empty frame that carries no brood, a thermoregulation geometry that is less efficient than a continuous brood surface. Drawn comb inserted with more care, placed at the lateral edge of the brood nest rather than within it, and warmed to hive temperature before insertion, allows the queen to expand into new laying territory without disrupting the existing brood geometry. The distinction is not minor. It is the difference between expansion that preserves brood distribution integrity and expansion that fragments it. Narrow intervention window. Once a brood distribution problem is developed mid-season, the window for correction before it affects the main flow foraging force is approximately 10 to 14 days, roughly the time between egg laying and the emergence of nurse bees that will transition to foraging in the pre-flow period. Beyond that window, the brood that will become the peak foraging force is already sealed. Its developmental outcome is set. Late season distribution problems, those occurring in June and July in temperate zones, produce a different damage profile. The main flow has already begun or is imminent. The foraging force is in the field. But the brood nest, if it carries an uneven distribution pattern from mid-spring mismanagement, may now be drawing forager-aged bees back into nurse bee duty to cover under-maintained open brood in the lower box. This is the mechanism that produces the counterintuitive inspection result. A colony with large numbers of bees present, active forager traffic at the entrance, and still, at the end of the flow, inadequate honey stores. The forager force was present, but foragers were cycling back into nurse duty, a behavioral reversion that occurs under brood stress conditions when the ratio of open larvae to available nurse bees exceeds a threshold. The colony chemistry shifts. Foragers re-engage with larval feeding. Nectar collection is suppressed. The superplacement timing adds a second layer of risk at this stage. A honey superplaced too late, after the foraging force has already engaged the flow, compresses the colony's storage behavior into an insufficient number of drawn frames. Bees will backfill the brood nest with nectar before moving into an unfamiliar super. If that super is introduced after the flow has peaked, the result is brood nest congestion, reduced laying space for the queen, and a distribution problem seeded for the post-flow brood cycle that will affect overwintering population. Foraging suppression compounds storage loss. Super placement should occur before the main flow begins, 10 to 14 days prior to the anticipated first bloom of the primary nectar source. On colonies that have demonstrated readiness, a minimum of 8 frames of bees, at least 4 frames of capped brood, drawn supercomb preferred over foundation. These are not arbitrary thresholds. They represent the population and brood geometry required to support simultaneous brood rearing and forager engagement, without drawing the nurse bee allocation into a deficit that suppresses one or both. The biological mechanism at the center of all of this, the single process that connects uneven brood distribution to reduced honey storage, is the nurse-to-forager transition and its sensitivity to brood load conditions inside the hive. A worker bee's behavioral development from emergence to foraging is not fixed by a rigid calendar. It is regulated by colony chemistry, specifically by the balance of brood pheromone, juvenile hormone, and the social inhibition signals produced by nurse bee density within the brood area. Under conditions where brood is distributed normally, nurse bee allocation is efficient. The brood area maintains stable temperature without excess thermoregulation labor, and the transition from nurse bee to forager proceeds on a relatively consistent schedule, typically occurring between 12 and 22 days after adult emergence, depending on colony need. When brood is distributed unevenly, the colony chemistry changes. Brood pheromone, the chemical signal produced by open larvae that suppresses foraging behavior and maintains nurse bee engagement, is present in scattered zones rather than in a concentrated, centrally organized source. The colony responds to that scattered signal by retaining more adult bees in the nurse role than a compact brood arrangement would require. The transition threshold shifts. More bees are held in nursing behavior for longer. The forager emergence that the colony needs for peak bloom is delayed or reduced. This is not a catastrophic failure. The colony does not collapse. Foragers are still produced. Nectar is still collected. But the efficiency of that forager production, the ratio of available foraging bee hours to available bloom hours during the flowering window, is reduced. And in a nectar flow that runs 14 to 21 days, a 15 to 20% reduction in forager efficiency during the first half of the flow produces a honey storage deficit that the colony cannot recover in the second half. Income lost from a missed or partial main flow cannot be recaptured that season. The corrective management that reduces uneven brood distribution damage is not a single action. It is a sequential decision process applied across the pre-flow period, guided by inspection data and governed by restraint at the moments when intervention is most tempting. The first decision point is feeding timing. Spring stimulation feeding, if it is applied at all, should not begin until nighttime ambient temperatures have stabilized above 10 degrees Celsius. The cluster has broken completely, and the population has reached a minimum of 5 frames of bees. Before those conditions are met, feeding stimulation risks driving brood expansion faster than the nursing capacity can manage. After those conditions are met, light syrup feeding at a 1-to-1 ratio, supports expansion without forcing it. The second decision point is brood frame management during expansion. As the colony builds through April, brood nest geometry should be monitored at every 7 to 10 day inspection. The healthy target is a compact, oval-shaped brood area with open brood in the center cells of each frame, and capped brood occupying the outer thirds. The frames immediately flanking the brood nest should carry pollen in the inner 2 to 3 cells, and honey in the outer columns. The standard pollen-honey arc that supports nurse bee feeding without interrupting brood continuity. If frames within the brood nest carry significant honey backfill, nectar, or capped honey packed into cells that the queen should be laying in, brood nest congestion is already developing. Frames of capped honey that have migrated into the center of the brood area should be moved to the outer edge of the second brood box or above a queen excluder if honey storage space has been added. This action must be done carefully. Moving brood frames to positions more than 2 frame widths from their original location risks disrupting the thermal cluster geometry, and should only be done when ambient day temperatures are consistently above 15 degrees Celsius. The third decision point is super placement. The decision to add the first honey super should be made based on brood and population indicators, not on the calendar alone. When the colony has reached 8 to 10 frames of bees, carries at least 4 frames of capped brood, and has begun clustering into the top bars of the upper brood box, it is physiologically ready to manage both brood maintenance and honey storage simultaneously. The super, placed at this point with drawn comb rather than foundation, presents no significant foraging suppression risk and allows the colony to direct surplus nectar into storage rather than into the brood nest. Placement 10 to 14 days before the anticipated first bloom allows foragers to orient to the super space before the flow begins. This pre-flow orientation is not incidental. Bees that have experienced the storage space before the nectar flow opens fill that space more efficiently than bees that encounter it for the first time during peak foraging activity. The inspection sequence that verifies brood distribution health at the critical pre-flow checkpoint, 14 to 21 days before the anticipated primary bloom, should be structured in 3 stages. The first stage is the population frame count. Count frames of bees by observing coverage from above without pulling frames. 8 covered frames is the threshold for a colony ready to handle both brood maintenance and active forager deployment. Below 7 frames, the colony will be managing brood at the expense of foraging, regardless of brood distribution quality. The second stage is the brood pattern evaluation. Pull the 2 center frames of the brood nest and examine brood coverage percentage. A compact, healthy brood surface will show 85 to 95% cell coverage on the central 2/3 of each frame. Cell coverage below 75% across the primary brood frames indicates a distribution problem. Note whether the pattern is consistent from frame to frame, or whether it deteriorates sharply toward the outer brood frames. A deterioration pattern indicates that the brood nest has expanded beyond the nursing capacity, and that contraction or population supplementation is needed before the flow. The third stage is the transition zone assessment. Check the frames immediately flanking the brood nest. The nurse bee density on these frames, visible as a thick covering of young, pale-bodied bees oriented toward the brood cells, indicates the current nurse allocation. A normal pre-flow colony should show dense nurse coverage on the outer brood frames, with the population thinning gradually toward the honey storage frames. If the nurse bee coverage is concentrated in one quadrant of the brood nest but thin in another, the distribution is uneven, and the queen's laying pattern has likely produced a geometric imbalance that will slow the nurse-to-forager transition in the underserved region. The resolution to this specific imbalance, uneven nurse coverage due to asymmetric brood distribution, is the careful repositioning of brood frames to place the densest capped brood laterally and the most open brood centrally, creating a single compact, thermally efficient brood cluster that nurse bees can cover uniformly without patrolling between fragmented zones. This is not a dramatic intervention. It is a geometry correction, but applied at the right moment, 14 to 21 days before first bloom. It allows the colony to move through the final brood cycle before the flow with a nurse bee allocation that produces a foraging force matched to the bloom timing rather than misaligned from it. Across the entire arc of this problem, from the early spring brood distribution that sets the nurse-to-forager ratio, through the mid-season expansion decisions that either preserve or fragment brood geometry, through the Preflow forager emergence that determines honey storage outcomes. The controlling variable is not colony strength. A large colony with uneven brood distribution will underperform a moderate colony with compact, organized brood at every stage of the seasonal production cycle. The bees have not changed. The mechanism has not changed. The flowering window has not extended to accommodate misaligned brood geometry. What changes, with precise management at the correct intervention points, is whether the colony's biological timing is synchronized with the nectar flow window or separated from it by brood distribution decisions made 4 to 6 weeks earlier, stabilizes production, reduces avoidable losses, synchronizes brood and bloom. These are the outcomes of managing brood distribution with biological understanding, rather than reactive hive opening and closing. The colony does not require correction at the moment the super is light. It required attention at the moment the brood pattern first showed irregularity. That moment passed before the nectar flow, before the foragers were flying, before the question of honey storage became relevant. Biology leads. The beekeeper adjusts, earlier than feels necessary, with more precision than feels natural, and with more patience than any single inspection seems to demand. That is how brood distribution is managed. That is how honey storage is protected. And that is what the colony's biology has always required. In every season, under every weather pattern, at every scale of operation, the timing was always the variable. It still is.